everyone. Good morning. It's good to see you this morning. If I haven't had a chance to meet you yet, my name's Jake, and just so glad that you're joining us as we wrap up our 4-week sermon series on generosity. Over the last 4 weeks, we've been examining 4 major themes of Jesus' teaching on money, with the goal to take what he has to say on this and to put it into practice and grow in generosity. And just as a way of quick review, so far we've covered the themes of there's more joy in giving than receiving, as we just got to hear from JT's story. That's so awesome. And then we also covered the theme of watch out for greed. And then last week, we covered the third theme, all we have belongs to God. And today, we come to our final theme, which is be generous to the poor. Be generous to the poor. Throughout the whole Bible, we read again and again about God's unique concern for the poor. In fact, biblical scholars say that if you were to count how many verses in the Bible are specifically about faith, it'd be somewhere close to 500. Or how many verses specifically about prayer, again, close to 500. But if you were to count how many verses there are about God's heart for the poor, it would be around 2,000. For example, one of those verses is found in Proverbs chapter 19, verse 17. It says, "Whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord." Meaning, God so closely identifies with the poor that to give to the poor is to give to God. And so, no surprise, Jesus has a lot to say about this in his teachings on money. And so we're going to dive into that this morning. And to help us do that, again, just to be upfront, I'm leaning on some material developed by John Mark Comer and the team at Practicing the Way. So some of what you're hearing is them, some is me, but all this is based on Jesus' teachings. And so on that note, I want to invite you to just stand if you're able, and we're going to read from Luke chapter 12. We were in Luke 12 last week. We're going to return there today, just look at verses earlier in that chapter. But before we read this, I want to give you a minute just to take a deep breath. And if you're willing, just invite God's Spirit to speak to you this morning. Luke 12, beginning with verse 29. "Do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it. For the pagan world runs after all such things, and your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." This is the word of the Lord. Well, John Wesley, famous Christ follower in the 18th century, founder of the Methodist Church, he was very well known for his generosity. In Randy Alcorn's book, Giving is a Good Life, great book, highly recommend to you. But in that, he tells a story of when Wesley had just bought pictures for his wall and to hang on his walls of his Oxford room, when he noticed that the chambermaid at his door was cold. She needed a winter coat, but he had very little money left to give her because he had just bought these pictures, right? And so he felt incredible conviction. And he said to himself, "Will thy master say, thou hast adorned thy walls with the money which might have screened this poor creature from the cold?" You know, as someone says. But in response to that conviction, Wesley started limiting his expenses, living simply. so that he would have more ability to help the poor. And at one time, his royalties from his book sales resulted in him making an annual income of the equivalent today of $160,000. But he lived on a salary equivalent today of $30,000. That he was very afraid, or he feared, you could say, storing up treasures on earth. That he wanted to store up treasures in heaven, so he gave away the money as quick as he came in, resulting in him basically giving away 80% of his income. Now, for the vast majority of us, including me, giving away 80% of your income, living on 20% is not real feasible. But I tell you that story for two reasons. One, because it is a great example of someone who took the teachings of Jesus on money very seriously, and they put them into practice in even a radical way, refusing to live a normal life. So I tell it for that reason. I also tell you the story because his story serves as stark contrast to the story that Jesus tells in Luke chapter 12, in the verses preceding the ones that we just read. And I want us to look at that story together. So if you will, we'll go back to Luke 12 and we're going to pick up in verse 13. Verse 13, Luke chapter 12 says, "Someone in the crowd said to him, 'Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me.' And Jesus replied, 'Man, who appointed me as judge and arbiter between you?'" Okay, he probably didn't say it exactly like that, but this is Jesus refusing to get sucked into this dispute between two over an inheritance, over a dispute on money, which is often what money ends up doing to relationships. So Jesus, he refused to get sucked in. He says in verse 15, "Then he said to him, 'Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed,'" which we looked at this verse, right, 2 weeks ago. Remember, Jesus says, this is dangerous. Watch out for this. Why? Because wealth lies to you. It tries to convince you that that's where life is found. So Jesus confronts the lie. Life is not found. It does not consist in an abundance of possessions. That's not where the good life is found. And then verse 16, he told them this parable. Here's the story. "The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, 'What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops.' And then he said, 'This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and I'll build bigger ones. And there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry.'" That line, eat, drink, and be merry, that was a famous line back then, as it still is to today. It's a line that was originated by Epicurus. It was the philosophy of the Epicureans, not the people of God. And so Jesus confronts it here. Verse 20, "But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?'" This word demanded here in the Greek literally means asked back. So Jesus is saying this guy is living as if all he owns is his, but in reality, he doesn't even own his own life. And so God comes and demands it back from him. See, Jesus calls this man a fool. And I know that sounds kind of harsh, doesn't it? But here's why. He tells us why. Verse 21. He says, "This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God." See, according to Jesus, this man was a fool because he tried to hang on to fleeting riches instead of using his wealth to pursue eternal riches, or what Jesus refers to here as being rich toward God. Now, what in the world does that mean, right? Like, how do you become rich toward God? Well, simply put, it's by using what we have, not just on ourselves, but to care for others. We become rich toward God by using what we have, not just on ourselves, but towards others, the care of others. See, earlier I quoted from Proverbs chapter 19, verse 17, but I only shared the first part of it. See, the entire verse says this. Whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his deed. Friends, when God is the one repaying you, you're rich toward God. When God is the one who says, okay, I'm going to pay you back, you're rich toward God. See, in Jesus' day, God's law instructed landowners to share their excess with the poor. For example, Leviticus 23, verse 22 said, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and for the foreigner residing among you. I am the Lord your God. See, if that's what this man had done in Jesus' story, then Jesus would have called him rich toward God. But instead of doing that, when this man experienced the abundant harvest, he tore down his barns to build bigger ones so he could store up the abundance for himself and eat, drink, and be merry. And so Jesus calls him a fool. The irony is, this is a little convicting, but the irony is, this guy was living the American dream, like literally. He had made enough to retire early and just take it easy. Two Harvard Business School graduates wrote a book called God and Money. And in it, they rewrite this parable for the modern world. Here's how they put it. This is great and convicting. The stock options belonging to a manager vested after a major run-up in share price. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I already have enough saved to send my kids to college. My house is paid off, and I already max out my 401k every year. And he said, I will do this. I will open an investment account and create a passive income portfolio, and I'll exercise my options and put the money there. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have a big enough portfolio to be financially independent. Retire early, plan some vacations, play golf. Yeah. Little nervous laughter, because let's be honest, there's so many of us and so many people, like this is their dream. Like this is the goal, right? Make a ton of money, retire early, live it up. So it's important for us to recognize that the villain in Jesus' story is our culture's hero. Yet to Jesus, he's a fool. But that stings a little bit, so let's keep moving. Jesus continues in verse 22. Therefore, meaning like in light of everything he just said, he says, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens, like look at the birds in the air. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn that they're tearing down to build bigger ones of, and yet God feeds them. Here's my favorite line. And how much more valuable you are than birds. Who of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to your life? Rhetorical question, right? Answer being none of us. In fact, we know now, thanks to science, that worry actually shortens your life. certainly doesn't add an hour to your life. So Jesus says, since you cannot do this very little thing, like, add an hour to your life, so why do you worry about the rest? Verse 27, consider how the wildflowers grow. They do not labor or spin, yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, how much more will he clothe you, you of little faith? Do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it. See, it's interesting to note that before the story of the rich fool, Jesus had confronted greed, right? Watch out, be on your guard against all types of greed. But coming out of that story, he turns the focus to confronting the fear of not having enough. See, greed is wanting more than you need, but the fear of not having enough is about fearing you're not going to have all that you need. And Jesus knows that it's both greed and fear of not having enough. Both of those work against us being generous. And so he addresses the fear right here, saying, do not worry about it, which, is easier said than done, Jesus, right? Like, okay, yeah, thanks. We'll stop worrying. But he doesn't just say, don't worry. He tells us why that's actually possible. Verse 21, verse 30, he says, for the pagan world runs after all such things, and your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. See, in these verses, Jesus is highlighting that the reason why we don't have to worry about not having enough is because you have a Father that says you are valuable. That you are valuable in the Father's eyes. The Father provider who is the creator of the universe finds you valuable. And he knows what you need, and he is able to provide. And so Jesus says, don't worry. You don't have to worry. Instead, seek his kingdom. Don't live like those who don't know God. Be free to live as the son and the daughter of the God who finds you valuable. Don't worry. Then he adds in verse 32, do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. And this kingdom that he tells you, seek first his kingdom, he also says your Father has been pleased to give you that kingdom. Like it's what he wants to do. It's his joy. It's his delight. That God, his heart towards you is not to hold back, it's to give generously. So don't worry. See, friends, it's because that's what God is like. We are free to do what Jesus says next. And everything that Jesus has been saying so far up in Luke 12 builds to this statement. Here it is. Verse 33. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. Notice how Jesus connects his call to be generous to the poor with an eternal perspective. See, Jesus' teachings on generosity will never make sense unless you view your financial decisions not just in light of the here and now, but in light of eternity. And here's why. Because in light of eternity, your giving is never a loss and always a gain. That in light of eternity, giving is not a loss, it is a gain. See, in the upside down kingdom of Jesus, what we give away, we actually keep. But what we try to keep for ourselves, we will lose, either in death or well before that. See, one of my favorite quotes of all time comes from the missionary martyr, Jim Elliot, who said, "He is no fool," there's that word again, "he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." And friends, giving to the poor is a way to invest in the kingdom of God, to give up what you cannot keep, to gain what you cannot lose. And so Jesus says here, give what you have away. Be generous to the poor. Give generously to care for others. Verse 34, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. We covered this sacred law of the universe in week 1, that our heart follows our money. And when we spend our money on things that do not last, that can be lost and are fragile, then our hearts are set up to be racked with fear or greed, wanting more or fear that we're going to lose what we have. But Jesus has a clear solution. Be generous to the poor. Be generous to the poor. For when you do that, your heart will align with God's heart for the marginalized and with the kingdom of heaven that will last forever. Now, it's worth noting that this is actually the second time in Luke's gospel where Jesus has said to be generous to the poor. And that is worth noting because in ancient writings, the ancient writings were hand copied. You know that, right? Which means that every word was expensive. And so the way that an author would really emphasize a point, it's not with like an exclamation point or something like that. It's by repeating it, by saying it again. And Jesus had just given this command 1 chapter earlier. And so Luke's original audience who would have heard this read out loud, their ears would have perked up when they heard Jesus repeat this in such close succession. For example, in Luke chapter 11, 1 chapter before this is what Jesus had said. He said this to the Pharisees. Now then, you Pharisees, clean the outside of the cup and dish, talking about like they look good to everybody, outward appearance. He says, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. You foolish people. Did not the one who made the outside make the inside also? But now for what is inside you, meaning like this greed, this wickedness that's in your heart, what do you do with that? He says, here it is, repeated phrase, be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean for you. Now, in light of Jesus' emphasis on this point, to be generous to the poor, it should come as no surprise that when we read about the first followers of Jesus in the book of Acts, we find that they did exactly this. See, in Acts chapter 2, we get the first description of the church. And here's what we're told. In verse 44, it says, all the believers were together and they had everything in common, and they sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Now remember, and this might be new information to you, but Luke and the book of Acts were written by the same author, Luke. And so it's a 2-volume set, right? And so here in Acts, the author Luke is highlighting that the church did what Jesus had said. And again, look, Luke chapter 12, verse 33, Jesus says, sell your possessions and give to the poor. Acts 2, verse 45, they sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Luke is saying, look, they did it. They practiced the way of Jesus. And this wasn't just a one-time event. This was a way of life. And Luke reiterates that in Acts chapter 4. We'll start reading verse 32. He says, all the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of the possessions was their own. You see the stewardship language there? But they shared everything that they had. And with great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. And God's grace was so powerfully at work in them that what? What was the sign that God's grace was so powerfully at work in all of them? It was this: there were no needy persons among them. For from time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. Friends, the early church was wildly generous to the poor. Tim Keller, pastor, he put it this way. He said the early church was financially promiscuous, which is a funny way to say it, but here's the full quote. He says, the early church was strikingly different from the culture around it in this way. The pagan society was stingy with its money and promiscuous with its body. A pagan gave nobody their money and practically gave everybody their body. And then the Christians came along and they gave practically nobody their body, and they gave practically everybody their money. In fact, one of the main criticisms from pagan Romans was that the church's generosity put the Roman world to shame. In a letter, the 4th century emperor Julian the Apostate wrote, "It's disgraceful that the impious Galileans," this slur for Christians, "support not only their own poor, but ours as well." See, it's hard to imagine now because of the impact that Jesus has had on the world. But if you just read any historian, read Tom Holland, any other historian, you'll see that there was no moral value in the Roman world for the rich to share with the poor. None. Nor was there any social services from the government or any tax-based wealth redistribution. Almost all of that work was done by the church. Early on, churches and monasteries, followers of Jesus, became sprawling centers of social justice. For example, St. Basil, the bishop of Caesarea in the 4th century, he founded what was arguably the very first hospital, which grew into a small town. And it had a hotel for travelers, a hospice care for the dying, a leper colony, a daily feeding program, and fixed hour prayer. And soon, his model of generosity spread all over the world. All of that good came from Jesus' followers actually practicing the way of Jesus and taking Jesus' call to be generous to the poor very seriously. Here's a quote from St. Basil. He says, "The bread which you do not use is the bread of the hungry. The garment hanging in your wardrobe is the garment of him who is naked. The shoes that you do not wear are the shoes of the one who is barefoot. The money that you keep locked away is the money of the poor. The acts of charity you do not perform are so many injustices that you commit." That sounds a lot like John Wesley, doesn't it? Just 1,400 years before Wesley. We live in a day really because of Jesus and the impact that he's had on the world that society has seen the value of caring for the poor. And we have a government that does a lot in social services for the poor. And as a result, it seems that this teaching from Jesus has either been forgotten or downplayed in the church today. It's interesting that the timing of this series and this teaching, because we're kind of at an interesting moment in our nation's history. I mean, as you know, most of, and not, well, really all of the funding for refugee services in our nation have been cut. Many other social services in our country are currently being evaluated and determined whether they're going to continue or not. And so we have an opportunity right now, church, followers of Jesus, to pick up a baton that was ours in the first place to practically meet the needs of people in our country and in the world. That this is what Jesus has taught us to do. And we have an opportunity, and there is a need for us to do it. So let's be generous to the poor. Let's do this. And just to be bold, let me say, we can all do something. All of us can do something. Even if it's small, even if it's $20 or an extra plate of dinner at our table, we can all do something, because here's one of the great laws of the kingdom of God, that when we entrust what we have to Jesus to care for others, he is able to make it go further than we could ever imagine. He takes our 5 loaves and he uses that to bless more people than we could ever expect. And so let's give what we have. You don't have to give what you don't have. Just give what you have. Some of us, that's money. Some of us, that's our time to serve others with our talents and our time, right? That's all good. Let's do something. Let's be generous to those in need. So you can do that by making a donation to this community that does so much good in our city. Or, of course, you could do that by giving to a million others, like nonprofits that will serve people throughout the world or here in our city. Of course, you could also just give to someone who is in your circle of relationships that's in need. Did you notice how in Acts 2, the passage, the synonym for the poor was anyone who had need? See, often we think of the poor as those in abject poverty in another country or those living on the streets here. And it certainly, absolutely does include them. But it's also fitting to simply ask, who do I know who has a need? You know, who do you know in our church or in your neighborhood, in your apartment complex, at your office? Who in your life has a need? The need could be a roof over the head or unpaid medical bills or transportation needs or just the gift of spending time with someone who is lonely. Just give what you have, not what you don't have. But friends, let's give. And when we give, let's remember that those in need are not objects of our pity. We're no way superior. They are fellow image bearers of our God. And our goal isn't just to give our resources to those in need, but to create a new kind of family, to blur the lines between giver and receiver as we practice the way of Jesus and love people with him and invite them to follow him with us as brothers and sisters. Friends, as we do that, may God create a community here where it could be said, there were no needy persons among them. Wouldn't that be awesome? So, let's follow the leading of the Spirit. Don't build bigger barns. Instead, let's be generous to the poor. On that note, in our guide, our week 4 invitation is to share your resources with someone in need. Each week, there's an exercise, practice, and that week, that's it. Share your resources with someone in need. In our guide, we've listed a few recommended nonprofits that we trust, and in some cases already partner with as a church family, like Safe Families and World Relief, which serves refugees here in Austin. And also, just by the way, to share something that's really been awesome that's been happening in our church over the last 3 weeks. Thanks to your generosity, last week, Midtown was able to cut a check for $10,880 to World Relief. Is that awesome? Yeah, praise God. We all gave that. That you're in many ways already practicing this. But let's keep it up. Not a one-time event. I like the early church. Just make this a way of life. And so, on that note, you'll see in your guide a few of the recommendations of ways to be generous to those in need. Of course, you can also practice generosity by meeting someone's needs personally, by buying their groceries or sending money to help pay for bills or leaving an anonymous cash gift or donating a car. We've had many people in our church give cars to people. It's a great way to bless. My encouragement is for you to pray and to see how God would lead you and who to do this towards. But let's all do it, friends. As we wrap up the series, let's be generous to those in need. And remember, all of this is motivated by love. See, we give our money away because Jesus gave his life for us. We give our wealth to the poor because Jesus gave up the wealth of heaven to become poor on our behalf so that we could experience the lavish riches of God's grace in Christ. And remember, also, we can do this joyfully. We can do this joyfully because our true happiness and life itself, for that matter, is not found in money and possessions. And it's also not found in a practice like generosity, as good as that is. Our life, our joy, our happiness is ultimately found in a person. It's a person of Jesus Christ who loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God.